try to record here. Good morning, everybody. Today's daf is Ayin Daled. We're going to start on Ayin Daled Amud Aleph. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 lines from the top, which is this is the sugya of borer, Masekhet borer. Tanu Rav, the rabbis taught, Hayu lefanav minei ochalin. If there were in front of the person several different types of foods or items, we're on Ayin Daled. Several different types of items. Borer ve'ochel, borer maniach. It says he can take some and eat it. He can take some and leave it. Velo yivror, but he shouldn't select. Vim berer, and if he selects, chayav chatat. This makes absolutely no sense, clearly. So, the melacha in question is Masekhet borer. The melacha is one of the 39 melachot of selecting. Borer. Okay? So it says, if he has several items in front of him, he can select and eat. He can select and leave some for others to eat. He can't select, and if he does, he has to bring a korban chatat. So what is it? Can he? Can he not? I mean, what's going on here? So the Gemara is going to give us several different suggestions for interpreting this Mishnah, each one of which is actually halachically valid. Okay? But is obviously only one of them is probably what the original Braita meant. But each explanation is going to try to bring some principles of Borer to explain it. So, what's the first one? So, Ma'ika Amar, what is it saying? Amar Ula says, Hachik Amar, that's what it means. Borer ve'ochel levovayom. He can select something if he's going to eat it that day. Uborer meniach levovayom. And he can select something and leave it for somebody else to eat today, meaning on Shabbat itself. Ulmachal lo yivror. But he should not select something which is for tomorrow. In other words, let's say he has in front of him shells mixed with nuts. I don't know, whatever it is. Okay, he has in front of him some kind of food mixed with bones, chicken with bones. So he shouldn't take the chicken off of the bone. If he wants to take the chicken off of the bone for right now, that's okay. But if he wants to take the food out of the mixture, okay, for tomorrow, we shouldn't do it. So that's what it means. He shouldn't do it for tomorrow. And if he did, chayav chatat. That's the Masekhet borer. In other words, according to Ula, what the Braita is saying is that the definition of the melacha of selecting is that you select it for another day. If you select it for now, you took the food away from the pesolet. From the pesolet means the stuff that you don't want. Okay, so there's a machloket rishonim if that means that it has to be something that is objectively bad or something that you don't want it. Whatever the case may be, there's pesolet, there's stuff that you don't want, and you're taking the ochel, you're taking the thing that you do want. So, Matkifla Rav Chizda says this is not possibly the explanation of Masekhet borer. V'chi mutar le'afot levavayom. Can you bake for just today, just for Shabbat? You can bake on Shabbat? V'chi mutar levashel levavayom. Can you cook on Shabbat? In other words, how can you define the melacha in terms of whether it's for tomorrow or for today? All melachot are defined as right now they're melachot. Doesn't matter if you're cooking for Shabbat or you're cooking for after Shabbat. It's a melacha, you're not allowed to cook. So borer is the same thing. You can't select. Ela Amar Rav Chizda, rather Rav Chizda says, borer ve'ochel pachot mikashior. It says you can he says, what does it mean when it says you can select? It means you can take out food that's less than the minimum amount. What's the minimum amount? That is the amount of a fig's bulk. Less than the volume of a fig, you're allowed to select. And similarly, you can take less than a shi'or, less than a fig's volume of food out of a mixture of various items. Okay? And what it means is that if you take a fig's bulk of food out of the mixture, that is the Masekhet borer, and now you have to bring a korban chatat. In other words, according to Rav Chizda, it's not about when you're selecting for, it's about how much. Quantitative, not time-wise, okay? Now again, the Gemara is going to... So normally we don't tell a person that you can do a prohibited activity as long as you do it less than the minimum amount. It's normally black and white. If you're not allowed to do something, even if there is a minimum shi'or, we always say, pachot mika shi'or, less than the minimum amount is still not allowed to be done. So matkifla Rav Yosef says, can you bake less than the measure? In other words, can you do any other melacha less than the required measure and get away with it? Obviously not. This Braita is telling us that there are circumstances under which we're allowed to do borer, we're allowed to select one thing from another. We still haven't found a compelling distinction between the case where we should be able to select and the case where we can't. Ela Amar Rav Yosef, rather Rav Yosef says, borer ve'ochel bayad. A person can select using their hand. Okay, now these are coming to the ones that are actually halacha l'maaseh, because we know that there are three conditions where you're allowed, that are the preconditions of borer, and they're all going to be mentioned here. So, borer maniach bayad, and similarly, you can select food and put it for somebody else to eat. So let's say you have a mix of chicken with bones or whatever else it is. So you're allowed to take the item that you want, the desirable thing, out of the undesirable thing with your hand. But you can't do it. What it's going to say is like this: if you take it with a kanona tamchoy, these are two items that are makeshift sifters. They're not actually designed to do sifting or to do selecting, but one of them is sort of like a funnel that they would use by putting some, let's say, chaff with some stuff that is with beans or something, and they would shake it so that the beans would roll down the bottom. Okay, a tamchoy is some kind of a plate that they would use that would be tilted or whatever it was in order to separate one item from the other. So these were makeshift sifting tools. So you're using a tool, but really you're not using the tool that was designed for the most effective sifting. So that's lo yivro. You shouldn't do that rabbinically. It's rabbinically prohibited. And if and if you use an actual sieve, if you use an actual tool that's designed for effective sifting, then lo yivror ve'im berer chayav chatat. So then, if you did it, you're chayav chatat. So I skipped one line. Lo yivror ve'im berer patur aval asur, right? Patur aval asur. Ubenafal v'kvara lo yivror ve'im berer chayav chatat. Okay. So what does it mean? So according to this, there are three levels. If you take it with your hand, you're allowed to. It's no problem. You're taking the food from the mixture with your hand, no problem. You're taking the food from the mixture using a makeshift sifter, like a plate or a funnel or whatever it is. You're not allowed to do it rabbinically, but you wouldn't be biblically culpable for borer in that case. And finally, if you use an actual sieve, you are culpable mideoraita. So, yeah.
If you use something that's an extension in your hand, like tongs.
That's allowed. That's allowed. Something that's held in the hand, like a fork, tongs, that's considered fine. So, Metkifla Rav Hamnuna raised an objection. Do you see anywhere in this Braita that it mentions different types of implements that are used for sifting? It doesn't say anything about that. You're pulling that out of your hat. That's not. It's not written here. Ella Amar Rav Hamnuna. Rav Hamnuna says borer ve'ochel ochel mitoch hapesolet. Borer meniach ochel mitoch hapesolet. Pesolet mitoch ochel lo yifor ve'im berer chayav chatat. You know what it means? It means like this: that you're allowed to take the good from the bad. We all know this halacha from Hilchot Shabbat. We're now familiar with it, but in the Gemara, they're bringing it as a principle to solve the problem. You're allowed to take the good from the bad on Shabbat, and you're allowed to take the good from the bad for you to eat it or for somebody else to eat it. But you're not allowed to take the bad out of the good. In other words, you're not allowed to remove the chaff from the beans. You're not allowed to remove the shells. Well, they would be muktzah anyway. That's another issue. You're not allowed to remove whatever it is that you don't want from whatever it is that you do want. The spoiled grapes from the good grapes. In a case where you had like a fruit salad and some of the grapes are a little bit rotted or spoiled. So you wouldn't be allowed to take that. You could take the good grapes and eat them, but you can't take the bad grapes out of the good.
What's it good if it's a red or white?
No, whatever you. Well, no, that's what I mentioned before. There's a machloket. There's a machloket if it's totally subjective based on what you want right now, or if there's some objective thing. Like Rashi says, that all of borer doesn't apply unless you have a clear thing that's called psolet. That is like actually psolet. That it's something like leaves or inedible material with edible material, but everything else is totally subjective. But others say no, it's what you want right now. So if you wanted an all white grape salad and somebody accidentally put red grapes, so then red grapes is pisola. That'd be an example. Okay, so and that's the way that we generally go. So matkif la Abaye. So nobody's satisfied with any of these answers. So now Abaye says that is not the reason. So in other words, Rav Hamnuna said that the distinction is that if you separate what you want, you're okay. If you separate what you don't want, now you're chayav chatat. Now you have to bring a korban chatat. That is because why? Because in one case you're taking it's considered part of the eating process. In the other case, it's a tikkun. You're improving this. You're removing the bad, so you actually improved let's say the salad or whatever it is by removing the bad. Matkif la Abaye said no. Midi ochel mitoch pesolet katani. If you're going to be so particular on Rav Yosef that he inserted words into the Baraita that are not there, you're doing the same thing. You're also inserting words. Didn't say anything about ochel, didn't say anything about pesolet, didn't say anything about edible, inedible, nothing. Ela Amar Abaye says, Borer v'ochel la'alter, u'borer maniach la'alter, u'levo v'yom lo yivror, v'im berer na'asa ke'borer la'otzar v'chayav chatat. So what does Abaye say? He says like this. What's the distinction? you're allowed to be borer immediately. In other words, if you're going to eat it right now, you have the red grapes and the white grape. You have the grapes with the spoiled grapes and the good grapes, whatever. You want to take the good grape and eat it right now? It doesn't matter that it's mixed in with the not good grapes. You can take what you want to eat right now. But don't separate, and you can separate it even to give someone else. Maybe Maurice wants a grape, I'll take it, give it to him. But what happens if you want to separate out all the white grapes because you're having people over for Sudash Lishit and it's 9 o'clock in the morning? So now you can't do it then because it's not alter, it's not being done immediately. So Abaye is coming around and saying what? That the distinction here is, but not between whether you're taking the bad or the good, the bad. It's between whether it is immediate or delayed. If it's delayed, it's also like you're creating something, because if you think about that idea of the distinction between eating versus creating. So if you take the bad out of the good, it's like you're making a better salad. That's not part of the eating. You actually did a separate process of removing what was bad out of the salad. Now you have a good salad. Similarly, if you separate the good from the bad, even separating the good from the bad can be creating something. If you're not eating it right now, but you're just making a better salad by taking the good and putting it in another plate or bowl. So the halacha lema'aseh is that all three conditions have to be met in order to do borer on Shabbat, which is, it has to be immediate, it has to be with your hand only or a fork, right? But it can't be with some tool that you're using for the sifting process, and it has to be the good from the bad. So those are the three rules that you have to observe. So if you either take the bad from the good, or you take it with a sifter, even if you're taking the good from the bad, but with a sifter, that would be no good. And if you're taking the good from the bad, but you're taking it for later, that would also not be good. So those three conditions have to be met to be satisfied to allow you to do borer on Shabbat. Amaru Rabbanan. Now, obviously, there has to be a line drawn between the Masekhet borer and eating. I mean, that doesn't mean that anything on your plate, you have to eat it now because they gave it to you. Jewish mothers would like that halacha, you know? They would give you a ton of food, and you're not allowed to pick anything. You have to eat the whole thing. So then how do we have eating? Okay, so now we say, Amaru Rabbanan Kamed Rava. So the rabbis told this interpretation of Abaye to Rava. Amar lo, he said to them, Shapir Amar Nahmani. Nahmani has said well. In other words, that interpretation is a good one. You have two types of food in front of you, and you took one, you selected it and you ate it, or you selected it and you left it for somebody else to eat. Rav Ashe matne patur. Rav Ashe said, exempt. Rabbi Yirmiyahu diftei matne chayav. Rabbi Yirmiyahu difti said, it's that you are culpable for violating Shabbat. So we have to find what case are you patur. Patur means you shouldn't do it, but you're not culpable biblically. And chayav means you're culpable biblically for doing it. So Rav Ashe matne patur batane chayav. How can Rav Ashe say that you're exempt if we already said that you are chayav? So this is a little obscure because it's presuming that we're talking about the case where you were using implements to separate. Okay? So the answer is la kashaha bekanon v'tamchoy ha benafal kvarad. The answer is that according to one version we were talking about using a sieve. Using a sieve is chayav. You were actually biblically culpable for selecting when you use a sieve. Using a makeshift type of sifter, like a plate or a funnel or whatever other item that you might use to sift. Sometimes you'll take a plate and you'll tilt it and let things all go to one side or whatever it is. So that would be patur. You would be exempt from a korban chatat, meaning it's not a biblical violation of borer because you didn't use a real sifter, a real sieve, but rabbinically you wouldn't be allowed to. Okay? So now we say, Ki ata Rav Dimi, when Rav Dimi came, Amar, he said, Shabtad Rav Bevai Havai. It was Rav Bevai's Shabbat. In other words, it was his turn to provide the kiddush, basically. His turn to provide the oneg. So he came. Ve'iklu Rabbi Ami v'Rabbi Asi. Rabbi Ami and Rabbi Asi came. Shadaka mayu kalkala de pere. He threw in front of them a whole basket of fruits. And by throwing it in front of them, all the leaves or whatever chaff and everything's automatically separated because he just dumped out the basket in front of them. Velo yadana, and I don't know. Was it because he says that you can't take the edible from the inedible? Even that is considered borer. Or it was just to show how generous he was, that he dumped the whole basket. If you leave a basket, people will take one and they think, I can't take any more because it's in the basket. You dump out the basket, now they see that it's all being served, right? So Tosafot says it can't be that he thought ochel mitoch hapesolet, that taking the food from the inedible is not allowed at all. That's not possible. You wouldn't be able to eat then anything. So what it means is that he must have been preparing this oneg beforehand. So he poured out the fruits on the table, and then the rabbis were coming later, and they saw that he had poured out the fruits on the table, and they were asking themselves, was the reason because he held that he couldn't take the good from the bad for later when they were coming? Okay, or was it just because actually he might be lenient about that, but he said that he wanted to show how generous he was. In any case, the halacha is that you cannot take even from the good from the bad, even if it's for later on that day. It has to be immediate in order to be allowed. Now, the next piece is a difficult one. Chizkiah Amar Chizkiah says, "Haborer tormusin mitoch pesolet shelahen chayav." Says if you take these tormus beans, whatever these beans are, out of their chaff, out of their pesolet. Okay, chayav. Even though you're taking the good from the bad, it's not allowed. Now the Gemara says, "Lema kasavar Chizkiah ochel mitoch pesolet asur." Are you telling me that Chizkiah says that you can't take the food from the? Then how can you eat anything? You're always going to be you can't eat chicken because you're going to leave the bone. You can't eat anything. So shane turmusim. The Gemara says that turmus is different because the shalkele shiv'ah zimnei. That because you boil it 7 times, ve'ilo, and it should be shalke according to Rashi le, masrach. And if you don't properly overcook this 7 times, it becomes ruined. V'chipsolet mitoch ochel dameh. And it's like taking the pesolet, the inedible, from the edible. So I'm going to take Rashi's second interpretation, which actually is the easiest one to fit with the Gemara, even though he gives a few of them. All the interpretations that are given here are very, very difficult. But the easiest one is Rashi's middle one, where he says, what is the story here? If you make a pot of these beans, there are different grades of the beans. So the lesser quality beans actually cook faster. Okay? So the first, let's say 1 or 2 or 3 times that you would cook it, each time you would change the water. You would remove some of the wormy beans out of the pot, and then you would recook it again. And then you would remove some of the bad, and then you would cook it again. So after 2 or 3 times of cooking, the lower grade beans were already cooked. But the higher grade, the bigger ones or whatever, the more robust ones, they took longer to cook. So if you were to take the larger beans out at that stage, when it had only been cooked 3 times, even though they're better quality after 7 times of cooking, right now, they're actually the pesolet. Right now, they're actually trash because you can't eat them. They're inedible. Only the smaller ones that are lower grade are good. So there's an irony that in the middle of the process, what ultimately would be your ochel, what ultimately would be what you wanted to eat, is right now your pesolet.
In the middle.
Right, in the middle of the process is your pesolet. And therefore, taking it out at that stage, ironically, the chidush is that even though the thing that you're taking is ultimately going to be the ochel, right now it's the pesolet. Another interpretation Rashi gives is that this was something that if you removed it at an early stage in the cooking, it would like turn to mush in your hand before it was properly prepared. What? Pistachios? Why? You're allowed to. You just have to put you can't hold the shells after. You can't take shells, but once you remove the pistachio, you just drop the shell. Yeah, that's okay. Yeah. So he brings another interpretation here that since you cook it so many times that it actually becomes very mushy. So if you tried to remove the beans out of the pot, they would fall apart. So that interpretation is saying that the reason why it's considered pesolet is that even though it's ochel when it's in the pot, when you remove it, it becomes pesolet. So that's the chidush. That something that in the process of removing it gets ruined would be considered pesolet. So, but in any case, there's some idea here that we look at something, we can't necessarily look at its ultimate. What Rashi is saying is we can't look at the ultimate destination of this item. Right now it's pesolet for you. When you remove it. Okay. So now the Gemara says,
It's kind of the concept of the swordfish. It's kosher when it's in the water, but when you
that's a way more complicated issue, but yeah. All right, so hava tochen. So now we get to the next melacha, which is grinding.
No.
So Amar Rav Papa says, Hi man de parim silka chayav mishum tochen. If you take beets and you cut them very fine, you mince them or dice them, so that's tochen, it's considered grinding. Now Tosafot says on the side that this only applies to certain vegetables, like beets, but other vegetables would be okay. There's a machloket, I believe, between the Ashkenazic poskim and the Sephardic poskim about this, about whether you can make like Israeli salad on Shabbat. where, if I'm not mistaken, the Sfaradim say that you can cut the Israeli salad on Shabbat. Ashkenazim say that you can't. There's a whole long discussion about it, and it's a concern about tochen, about chopping very fine. It's like grinding. It's like grinding. Amar Rav Menashe says, if a person chops wood into little chips, it's also tochen, it's also grinding. Amar Rav Asher says, it depends. If he's just chopping them into small pieces because he wants to throw it into a fire, that's grinding. If he's chopping it to a specific size, that's a different melacha, mechatech. That's the reason why you can't cut like paper towel, for example, because you're cutting it to size. You're cutting it to a specific size. That's a separate melacha. It's not grinding. It's cutting to size. Halash ve'aufeh.
Not according to the Chabad.
I don't know about that. I can't comment on that. So halash ve'aufeh. What they allow it?
Yeah.
Oh, I had no idea.
The Rebbe, yeah.
Okay. So anyway, kneading and baking. So Amar Rav Papa says, Shavak Tana Didan Bishul Samemanin Tava b'Mishkan V'Rakat Ofet. Why is it that the Tana that wrote the Mishnah, instead of using the actual example that we have from the Mishkan, because all the melachot are based on the Mishkan, which was that they would cook the dye, they would cook the vegetables for use in dyeing the various parts of the Mishkan. Why doesn't he use the example of cooking that was taken from the Mishkan? Why does he use baking? There was no baking of anything that went into the construction of the Mishkan. They didn't have to bake anything. So, because it's not the avodata Mishkan, it's the construction of the Mishkan that we learned it from. There was baking for like the menachot and stuff like that, but that's part of the avodah of the Mishkan. We learned from the construction of the Mishkan. Yeah. So Tana Didan Sidura de Patnakat. Our Tana wanted to take the order of preparing bread, because that's something that's more accessible to the average person. Most people don't boil dye in their house, but everybody bakes bread, or most people do. Amar Rav Acha bar Rav Avira, Rav Avira said, Hayman de shadas sichta la'atuna, chayav mishum bivashel. If a person takes a wooden peg and puts it in the oven to harden it, okay, to dry it out, it's considered mivashel. Pshita, that's obvious. Ma'u detema, what might you have thought? Why would you have thought it's not cooking? Lisharure mana kamechaven. Because really, what ultimately do you want to do? You want to harden this peg, right? You want to dry it out and make it firm. But the fact is, kamash malan de mirparafe v'hadar kamitz, that really initially it softens, and softening an item with heat is considered bishul. So even though ultimately it's going to harden, right now it's going to soften. Amar Rabba bar Ravuna says, Hayman de artach kufra chayav mishum vashel. If you take solid pitch and you melt it down into liquid, that's considered cooking. Pshita, that's obvious. Ma'oditem, I'm melting down into liquid, is not going to be cooking. I mean, what would you have thought? Kevan da'adar v'ikusha emalo. Maybe you'll think that since it's going to harden again, it would be like melting wax. Right? You melt wax, it's not going to stay melted unless you keep it hot. So if you melt wax and then you leave it, it will become hardened again. So you might think, since it's going to end up in its original state anyway, my bishul is not having a permanent effect. It's only a temporary effect. So perhaps I shouldn't consider it cooking. Kamash malan, that's why he comes along to tell you that even if the effect is only temporary, certainly it's considered bishul. Amar Rava says, Hayman de avar chavita chayav mishum sheva chataot, tanura chayav mishum shmona chataot. That if a person were to make, shmona chataot rather, if a person were to make a barrel, they will end up being required to bring 7 chataot, and if they make an oven, 8 chataot. So Rashi explains the reason for this number. Okay, so you have to really follow the Rashi to see it. So he says, first, tochen haregavim, v'shochakan hadek, have tochen. So the first thing you do is to make this earthenware, I'm reading from Rashi, the first thing you have to do to make this earthenware jug or this container is you have to grind the mud, grind the dirt. So that's tochen. Uborer atzrorot agasot mitochan, then you remove the rocks from it. That's called borer. Hareshtai, umarkidan binafa. And then you're going to sift it through a sieve. And that's another one. So that's number 3. Umegabelatit. And then you're dahainu lash. And then you're going to knead it into a type of doughy mixture that's lash. Umemareachatit. And then you're going to smooth it out into the shape. Kishu ose agolem. She'echalak. Hare mimachek. That's mimachek. In other words, smoothing out. Umav'irata urba kivshan. Then you're going to light a fire and you're going to have to harden it in the heat, right? So, and he says, however, the digging from the ground is not going to be actually malacha in and of itself, because digging a hole in the ground is only when you need the hole. but he took the dirt out of the ground to make it, so we're not going to count that. So you end up with 7 chataot. Why is it 8 if you make an oven? Because he says that the reason is that there's gemar melachto. In other words, there's a separate melacha called makeba patish. Hitting something with a hammer, meaning finishing off something, is a separate melacha. What's the finishing off that you're doing? You're going to coat it with an additional layer of insulation. And because you're coating it with an additional layer of insulation, there's an extra step in the making of the oven that making of the jug doesn't have. No, you could do this on Shabbat. For each individual step, you're going to be chayav. Yeah, because each individual step, you're going to be chayav. Yeah, it's just telling you.
Let's say you just do them on Shabbat. You for step 1 this Shabbat, step 2 next Shabbat, step 3.
Yeah, anyway, it doesn't matter, right? So Amar Rabbi Abai says, "Hayman de avar chalta chayav." A person who makes a basket chayav 11 chataot. He's going to have 11 chataot. V'chayte lefumei chayav 13 chataot. And if he weaves a lip around the edge of the basket, he's going to be, or sews rather, a lip around the edge of the basket, he's going to be 13 chataot. So now if we look at Rashi again, he'll tell us what are the 11 things that he does. Chayav Yud Aleph, he's going to be Chayav 11. So Merakanim, first of all, he's going to take the reeds that he makes the basket out of. That's kotzer, that's reaping, harvesting. Umishum notea. And it's also considered notea, it's also considered planting, because when you cut the reeds, you stimulate their growth. So you got 2. So asafam yahad. So then he, the fact that he gathers them together, harei me'amer. That's called gathering. Gathering is another melacha. Berer yafot, harei borer. Then he's going to choose the best one. There's borer. Hechlikan, harei mimachek. Then he's going to smooth them out. That's mimachek. Asan dakot me'achat shtayim o shalosh. He's going to cut them into either 1, 2, or 3 pieces to make them small, thinner, to make them weavable, basically. So that's another melacha of tochen. Chatachan b'midah, then he's going to cut them to size. So he cut down their quantity, that's tochen. Then he's going to cut them to size, right, he splits them. So then that's going to be mechatech, cutting to size. Then what happens is he's going to set them up on the loom. He's setting up the loom to weave the basket. That's mesech, that's a separate melacha. Okay, arag, achat lemala v'achat lemata, kedei lahamido. Then he's going to weave on top and on the bottom in order to hold it in place. Because the way that they would sew it, I think they probably have a picture in one of these Gemarot. They probably have pictures of it. The way that they would set it up required sewing around in a certain area to hold the pieces, and then the weaving process would begin. So that's another melacha. And then afterwards, and then you would have straggling sort of pieces on wickers. Sometimes you have the pieces sticking out, so they would cut them, and that was makeba patish. That was the final completion of the basket. So there are many, many steps. Each step is a separate melacha. That's 11. Now, if you make if you're going to make a lip around, that's going to require more sewing, not just weaving the basket, which was done with a loom. That they would weave it, but actually sewing on top, or you're going to actually have to tie. You've already done sewing, so that melacha was already counted, but you're going to have to tie as well as sew on top of the on the lip of the basket in order to make a lip for it. So it's going to come to a total of 13 chataot. The point is to illustrate to you how one activity can actually include many different steps, each of which is its own independent melacha that you would be chayav for independently. Somebody who shears wool or whitens it. So Amar Rabbi Yochanan, hatovet semer shel gabei behema b'shabbat chayav shalosh chataot. If a person were to spin the wool on the sheep while it's still attached to the sheep on Shabbat, he would be obligated in 3 chataot. Achat mishum gozez. Obviously, eventually he's going to shear the sheep. So one will be when he removes the hair. It's going to be one. Ve'achat mishum benapetz. He's going to comb it. Obviously, he has to comb it because it's going to be tangled in order to spin it. And then of course, the spinning into thread is going to be a separate melacha. Rav Kana says, "In derech geziza bekach, ven derech menapetz bekach, ven derech tivoy bekach." That this is not true, because it's not the way to shear a sheep, to do the shearing of the sheep when it's already spun into threads, and it's not normal to spin threads on the animal, and it's not the normal way to comb it while it's attached to the animal, so it shouldn't be. It shouldn't be counted as a malacha. Velo, is that really true? But it says in the Braita, Mishmei de Rabbi Nechemia, and the name of Rabbi Nechemia, that Shatuv ba'izim, v'tavu ba'izim, that they would actually wash, when they made the Mishkan, it says, tavu et ha'izim, that they made threads out of the goats. It doesn't say the hair of the goats, but it says the goats themselves, which means they washed the wool while it was still attached to the animals, and they made the threads while it was still attached to the animals. So alma tviyal gabe be'ema shema tviyah. So you see that in the case of the Mishkan, it was considered to be making threads even though it was still attached. So chokhmah yitera shaneh, that was special chokhmah that the women had in that generation to be able to do that. Most people can't do that, and that's why it's not considered the normal way of doing the malacha. So if you actually did decide to give like a hair weave to your animal, I don't know, braid your animal's hair and make it into threads, apparently that would not be counted as a malacha because it's not normal. Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbi said, if a person removes the wing from a bird on Shabbat, v'akotimo, and the person who plucks the feathers, the person who cuts it to size, v'amorato, and the person who removes the hairs from the bottom of the feather, chayav shalosh chataot, he would be liable for 3 chataot, because there were 3 things that they would do. One was that they would pluck the feather out, and then they would cut it because they just wanted the feather, they didn't want the stem, and they would also remove the hairs from the stem itself because they would use that for other things. So they would use like the hard part at the bottom of the feather for other things, so they would remove the hair that would stick off of it. Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish says, "V'amar Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, tolesh chayav mishum gozez." The person who removes the feather from or the wing from the bird is obligated for the melachav gozez, shearing. Kotem, the one who cuts it, chayav mishum chatech. This is because of cutting, and mimared chayav mishum mimachek, and the one who removes the hairs from the wing of the bird or from the feather at the bottom of the from the hard piece at the bottom of the feather, is smoothing out that surface for other use. So that is mimachek. Hakosher v'amatir. Now we have tying and untying. Kishiraba mishkan hecha havai. Where do you find tying in the Mishkan? Amar Rav Rava says, they would tie to the they would have in the ground pegs, and they would tie the curtains or the tent to pegs. That was the tying and the untying. So but that's only temporary tying, and we know that the melacha on Shabbat is permanent tying. So that can't be where we learn it from. Ela Amar Abai says she can order giriot shenifsek alein nima koshrim ota. No, what happened was Abaye says that sometimes the curtains, one of the threads in the curtain would break, and they would tie it back together. Amar le Rava says, that's good for tying, but what about untying? Where is there untying as part of a process of something in the Mishkan? He said, don't tell me that if you had 2, let's say for example you had 2 threads in the curtain, and they both broke, and you had to tie both of them so that you'll have 2 knots next to each other in the middle, right in the middle of the curtain, that looks ugly, so they would actually untie one of them. He says that's not true. They wouldn't do that because that would leave a hole in the fabric. And for a king, if the king had a curtain, would they do that? Certainly not. They wouldn't do that. They wouldn't leave a hole like that. So rather, Ela Amar Rav Rava says Rabbi Ilai, and some say it was Rabbi Ilai. Sheken Sadeh Chilazon Koshinu Matirin. What happened was that those who would catch the chilazon, they would have to catch the chilazon fish in order to dye for techelet. They wanted to get the blue dye. So in order to do that, they would have to tie nets. They would make their nets through tying. And sometimes they would have to untie in order to tie, to add an extension, basically, on the net to make it larger. So untying and tying was something that they had to do with the nets for catching the chilazon, and that's why it's a malacha on Shabbat. So the very last part, vatofer shetei tefirot, somebody makes 2 stitches on Shabbat, v'alo kaima. But how can making 2 stitches be a malacha? It's not going to stay. It's not permanent. You didn't tie it. So the answer is, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, it's only a malacha of stitching if you tie the ends of the string. If you leave them loose and you just put it through twice, that you can pull it right out. that's nothing. So you have to have tied it on the ends in order to constitute a melacha, because it has to be something that's going to have a permanent and lasting effect. Have a great day, everybody.